Cade Mila Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. Happy Easter. I have a topic very close to my heart for Easter. And I usually don't do a big thing on Sundays. I give everybody a little break. I thought this was important. Something I've been wanting to do. This will be especially poignant, I think, for most of my viewers who are Irish and who know about this. And for a lot of Americans, I suspect much of this will be new information, and I think you are going to find it interesting. Now, what am I talking about? Well, I'm going to talk about the 1916 Easter Rising in Ireland, also known as the Eastern Rebellion, the Easter Rebellion. This happened on April 24th, 1916, on the Monday after Easter Sunday, and it began all over the country but led by forces in Dublin. So what happened? On April 24th, Patrick Pearse, an Irish language activist, and I think it's important to know right away that the occupation of Ireland by the English for generations resulted in acculturalization. They tried very hard to destroy the Irish language. Speaking Gaelic, which is the Irish language, became punishable by death. It was not allowed to be taught in the schools. And you sometimes hear about the ditch schools where priests actually kept the language alive in some areas of the country by teaching children by hiding in irrigation ditches, because they even weren't allowed to educate their children. It was against the English law imposed on the Irish people. They were an occupying force, oppressive. I'm pretty militant about this. Bear with me. I think this leads a lot to my sense of outrage for African Americans. It's not the same, but it's a parallel experience. Patrick Pearse, who was an Irish language activist, a school teacher, and a member of the Fenian Military Council of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and we're going to talk about that, along with the Irish Citizen Army led by John Connolly and 200 women of the Cumann, I said that wrong, I think, Cumann. It's in Gaelic, and as you now should know, Gaelic and the written words, Americans could never, and it's not pronounced the way it's spelled. So the women of Cumann organization, they seized strategic buildings in Dublin, all over the area, other places, and proclaimed the Irish Republic. This was an armed insurrection. That term should be familiar. It was launched by people identifying as Irish Republicans. This has nothing to do with American Democratic Republican parties. These are people who wanted a democratic republic in Ireland. And it was launched against English rule in Ireland. They hoped to establish an independent Irish republic while the English were distracted, busy fighting World War I, during which the Irish were neutral. This was the first sign of any kind of an uprising against English occupation in Ireland since 1798. This was organized by the Irish Republican Brotherhood. This was a secret, oath-bound fraternal organization dedicated to an independent democracy, an independent Republican democracy. And they existed from 1858 to 1924. They were supported by Americans. A lot of people don't know this. There was a group in the United States from 1858 to 1870 called the Fenian Brotherhood. They eventually became the Clan Nagal, and they were Americans supporting the Irish for independence, and they're often just called Fenians. The Irish Republican Brotherhood was the chief advocate for an independent Irish republicanism, and they were the drivers of this movement. They were a successor to previous attempts, to the United Irishmen of the 1790s, to the Young Irelanders of the 1840s. Their slogan, which Americans might be familiar with, was Éireann go Bragh, spelled wrong in the United States, but still, which loosely translated means Ireland forever. Hang on here, I have to, it's written all over the place. So part 2 here. Patrick Pearse stood up at the General Post Office and made this announcement. So they took over all these buildings and they made the General Post Office their headquarters. Now, the post office in Ireland, anyway, is more than just a place where you mail your letters. There's a lot of government business done in a post office. It's where you pick up your pension and deal with other government entities. And to take control of this was to really get your grips on some of the wheels of government. The English army, in response, taken by surprise, brought in thousands of soldiers. They brought in artillery, and they drove a gunboat up the Liffey River through Dublin. There was street fighting on all the routes into the city center. The Irish inflicted many casualties. This was definitely guerrilla warfare within an urban environment. And they caught the English unawares at first. There was a lot of sniping that was done. Main guerrilla positions, rebel positions, were eventually surrounded, overwhelmed by numbers, which we'll get into, and bombarded with heavy artillery. When this was over, you should see the pictures online of what Dublin looked like. There were isolated actions all over Ireland, but there was some dissension in the ranks about how and when, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And a guy called Ian McNeill gave counter orders. People were confused, and not as many volunteers mobilized as they had hoped. Not because they didn't want to, not because they were afraid, but because they got bad information. Eventually, after 5-6 days, they had an unconditional surrender on Saturday, April 29th. The British immediately declared martial law in Ireland. The English took more than about 3,500 prisoners and sent 1,800 of them to concentration camps in England. The 16 leaders were executed, but as we'll find out, they weren't all leaders. They just scooped people up and executed them. And public opinion, at first, they were completely taken by surprise because most people were not involved in this. They didn't know it was going to happen. There had been ongoing, as I'm sure people are aware, the debate about what to do about the English in Ireland was heated and lengthy over generation after generation, and many attempts had been made, and there were mixed opinions about it. The majority of people wanted them out, but there were vocal mixed opponents of that. And they were often in positions of power and authority. They were the ascendancy. These were people who were descendants of English invaders who had been given land in Ireland, kicked the Irish off their own land to fallow ground, leading to the famine, and built these big stone piles, which I've been to one of them. It's very interesting. If you go to Ireland and people say, oh, the history, go tour this estate manor, this manor house. You need to look at that with a jaundiced eye. So public opinion was forever changed during this by the brutality of the English response to the Rising. And in 1918, the election was won by Sinn Féin, which was a political party. They convened the first Dáil, and the Dáil was like the parliament, and they declared independence. So that was a surprise. After they toted up the casualties, there were 260 civilian dead from the English action. There were 145 English soldiers killed and 82 rebels, which includes the 16 who were summarily executed after the fact. There were 2,600 wounded. Parts of central Dublin were in complete ruin. Now let's go back. It was collating sources, and it gets a little confusing. So this rising, which we're going to talk about more, but the rising itself led to the establishment of the first Dáil Éireann, which was in 1919, the parliament. It was a revolutionary unicameral parliament from 1919 to 1922, formed on January 21st, 1919 by Sinn Féin. They were a democratic socialist political party, very left-wing. I believe they still are. And I was going to look up how to pronounce this. I'll look it up later. Their motto was "Time for Change." Okay, let's see here. So Sinn Féin was founded by the Irish Republic. Sinn Féin founded the Irish Republic in an official way, set up the parliament, and then became very active in the War of Independence. So very, very briefly to go over a little bit of this history, and there's a lot of detail that I gloss over because it's just too much. So if you're very conversant about this, it's not because I didn't read it, it's because it was unnecessary for the larger picture if this is just a casual introduction to the topic. So this guerrilla war, this War of Independence, was known as the Anglo-Irish War. It was the IRA, which was the Army of the Republic, against the English Army. And the English Army sided with, had siding with them paramilitary groups. For example, the Royal Irish Constabulary, it's quasi-military, and the Ulster Special Constabulary was paramilitary. It was 1919 to 1921, and it ended in the very controversial Anglo-Irish Treaty. This established what became known as the Irish Free State in the South, and they would be treated like a dominion, like Canada. Free but not free. And this created Northern Ireland, and it was signed by Lloyd George and Michael Collins of movie fame, and a guy called Arthur Griffith, and other people as well, lords, masters. Michael Collins was in that movie with Julia Roberts, possibly the worst fake Irish accent I've ever heard in my life, just saying. So this all led to the Irish Civil War because they divided the country and there was conflict about that. On signing this Anglo-Irish treaty, one of the signatories, Lord Birkenhead, said to Michael Collins, "Mr. Collins, in signing this treaty, I am signing my political death warrant." Collins replied, "And I, sir, am signing my actual death warrant." And on August 26th, shortly after the signing, Collins was ambushed and shot by opponents of the treaty. The treaty was an unwelcome compromise. It was a departure in the signatories in their departed from the Constitution of the Irish Free State that was later created in 1932. Eamon de Valera was involved in that. The English basically wanted what they called home rule, but as kind of the nannies, they felt that they could never possibly leave the Irish to determine their own fate. And so they offered this dominion status for the 26 southern counties, and they partitioned off the northern 6. This is financial and this is ego. We're talking a refusal to admit that the sun is setting on the English Empire and not wanting to let go of the financial benefits. Something a lot of Americans don't understand is when the English occupied Ireland for a very long time, As I said, they kicked the natives off their own farmland, forced them into sort of a serfdom. They had to work on the estate. They had to meet certain requirements of production. And everything that was grown, all the animals, everything, meat, fruits and vegetables, grains, produced in Ireland by the people of Ireland under servitude to the English landowners, all of that was sent out of the country and the natives starved. That was the cause of the potato famine. The Irish were pushed onto land that grew nothing. And they figured out how to at least grow potatoes, a gift of the New World. And potatoes, you can stay alive for about a year on nothing but potatoes. So they depended on them for survival. And they were semi-starving, malnourished, when a disease, a potato blight, hit. And in literally overnight for many people, killed the entire potato crop of Ireland. And the Irish had nothing to eat, and the English gave them nothing. They still shipped the food out. They also put the Irish on ghost ships, most starving, many sick, many naked, no food, no water, one-way trip to Canada or Australia. I'm just saying. To go a little bit towards explaining why there are such heated emotions. So they wanted home rule. They couldn't let the Irish determine their own fate, but they'd pretend they did, and was contentious. So a little background. In the 1800, the English were already there. But in the 1800 came the Acts of Union, where the English abolished the Irish Parliament, made Ireland a part of what they called the United Kingdom, and they did allow them representation within the English Parliament, but, kind of outvoted. The nationalists opposed this. The Irish people were like, what? No. And the people had been mistreated and poorly governed. The English really didn't care. They considered them subhuman. They were an economic resource and, led to the famine. And I said, this is caused by the English, not by potatoes. So the Home Rule movement hoped to achieve a self-government. And there were several proposed bills. I'm not going to go into all of it. It's confusing and it's tedious to read about, the political Machiavellian maneuvering. But the people became really disillusioned because every time they had hope, it was cut out from under them. And eventually they just disassociated from this particular form of government entirely. They became more radical extremist separatists. Now, keep in mind, this is their own country. And there was an Irish cultural revival. And this was led by William Butler Yeats, along with a woman named Lady Gregory. Now, the Irish, they're not lords and ladies. There are people who tell you that they are Irish lords and ladies, but look back in their genealogy. She had turned against her pro-English class that she'd been born into. She was born into the landed gentry, transplanted from England. And so by birth, she was Irish, but culturally very much a part of this apartheid system. But she rejected it. She was a good person. And she was very much about cultural nationalism. She helped to establish the Abbey Theatre, still going on today, famous internationally. They were huge proponents of all things Irish culture, Gaelic football, Irish theater, Irish language, which had been almost completely decimated at this point. And they encountered huge public support for an independent Gaelic Ireland. They almost lost at the beginning with a thing called the Statutes of Iona and the colonization of Ireland by English-speaking Protestants. And people think the Irish are so stupid, fighting about religion. Well, if you get people isolated in religious, segregated, economically deprived, educationally deprived areas, you will get a group of people who will fight over religion. It happens everywhere. But in the same way that when you think of Baptist, you think of the American South. When you think of Quakers, you think of Pennsylvania. When you think of California missions, Catholic. Regional places are often associated with a religion just by virtue of who gets planted there. And that's what happened in Ireland. Ireland originally was a pagan country. Celtic, pagan. Still a lot of roots to that. St. Patrick drove that out. That's the symbology of the snake. The snake was a representation of the goddess. He drove the goddess out of Ireland. And the Catholic Church took over, hook, line, and sinker, I might add. And then when the English invaded, they transplanted these landed gentry who were Protestant because they were English. So that's where that religious dissension, religious discord comes from. It's not because the stupid Irish fight about religion. Now that's in some places, that's actually what it boils down to. But there's a history behind it. So the main language areas where Gaelic was still spoken was an area called the Gaeltacht. And the Gaeltacht Gaelic was the main vernacular. And these are areas of Connemara, Donegal, and Mayo. And I've been to Donegal, and it's fabulous. So, the Irish Unionists identified with England. They wanted union with England, and they were largely Protestant by virtue of their heritage, descendants of occupiers, and they, born in Ireland, yes, but descendants of occupiers, and they opposed home rule or independence because they feared being ruled by Catholics. Volunteer militias formed. This might sound familiar to everybody right now. On both sides, there were the Ulster Volunteers who were pro-English. There was the Irish Republican Brotherhood, was the driving force behind the Irish Volunteers, which were a paramilitary pro-Republican formed in 1913. And its leader was Ian McNeill, and he was not a member of the Irish Brotherhood. I get the sense it was a bit elitist. And he embraced he rejected the notion of distinguishing anybody by virtue of religious affiliation, political affiliation, or class. The Irish Republican Brotherhood was more nationalistic for a Republican, democratic socialist type thing. So World War I broke out, and the aggression of the English army, who had brought Ireland very close to civil war, right before World War I, very close to civil war because they were doing things like shooting civilians randomly. The English army got distracted. And in American newspaper, this used to drive me crazy when I was younger. Now I understand. This is called propaganda. My parents got several different types of Irish newspapers. And they'd be a month old or something, but they got them delivered to us in California. And the news was like two different planets, especially during the Troubles, right? And American media did not cover the situation appropriately. And it's kind of like, I'm trying to think of an example. It's kind of like the media covering what's going on now, by talking about Uncle Sam. The American media, when they talk about Ireland, it's the Lucky Charms leprechaun, which is so offensive, but that's another story. So there was a whole lot of threatened violence. There was actual violence on the part of the English. The English had barracks all over the place and armed soldiers everywhere. And they, well, you know what's going on in the South right now and has gone on in the forever. Same situation in Ireland. So when the war broke out and the aggression was a little bit distracted, and there had been a whole lot of legal fighting and fighting with the parliament and trying to come to some sort of solution. And a month after the English declared war on Germany, there was a meeting, September 5th of 1914, of the Supreme Council of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And keep in mind, all of this was secret. And they agreed to stage an uprising before the end of World War I. So they assigned jobs, and to plan it was a guy called Tom Clark and Sean McDermott. The Irish Volunteers, which was a smaller faction, so they English war effort began, and some of the Irish Volunteers were all good with supporting the English war effort, And so the splinter group that wasn't for supporting anything English became involved in the planning of this rising. And they made the director of military organization, Patrick Pearse, the director of military operations, Joseph Plunkett, and the director of communications, Eamon Kent. And there was disagreement about how and when to have the rising. I mean, this was difficult. Communications weren't as easy. And Ireland, it's a small country. It doesn't take very long to go from east to west in Ireland, a few hours by train. But we're talking the early 19-teens, 1914 here, 1916. Communication was really difficult. Many remote rural communities, and they were all involved in this. So there was disagreements, and the council leaders were sidestepping local volunteer leaders for various reasons that I won't even go into, but the biggest one was fear the English would find out. A man called Roger Casement got involved. He was an English diplomat, but he was an anti-imperialist. He was a humanitarian activist and a poet, and he became a leader in the rising. He's now today known as the father of 20th century human rights. I bet you didn't know that. Because of the investigations that he was involved in the Boer War, reporting on English abuses in the Congo in 1905. He was in Peru looking at abuses of the rubber industry against Amazonian indigenous people. And he became involved in planning this rising, which we'll get into, and he was hanged by the English on the 3rd of August, 1916 for treason. What did he do? Well, he was a diplomat, and he had been in diplomatic contact with the Germans before the war broke out, the First World War. And he sought out German military aid for the Irish 1916 rising. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So he met with the German ambassador and a guy called John Devoy from the Clan Nagal. And the English government found out and got him. And then they went on a campaign to destroy his character, in their eyes, by highlighting his sexuality. And as you will find out, I'm proud to say the LGBTQ community was instrumental in the Irish Rising. Men and women, and Roger Casement was an example. So the English destroyed his public persona, and as a result, there was no support, because Irish is such a conservative country. There was no support for clemency for him, and so they hanged him. He had plans for a German expeditionary force to land on the Irish west coast to secure the River Shannon in this uprising. In 1915, there was a funeral for an old man called Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa. I have a second cousin whose name is Rossa, named after him. And Patrick Pearse gave the oratory at his funeral, big public funeral, and he had fought assiduously for Irish independence for decades. And Pearse is quoted as saying, "Ireland unfree shall never be at peace." Talk about your prophetic words. So, okay, they got together, they made the plan, they signed the jobs, they got their stuff together, they thought they had help from Germany, and Pearse ordered 3 days of parades and maneuvers starting on Easter Sunday, not telling a lot of these guys that this is the real thing, the uprising will begin, because there was just such a fear of spies in the camp. So the German Navy sent 20,000 rifles, 1 million rounds of ammunition with explosives to Ireland, and Casement went to Ireland on a German U-boat, a submarine, I think the U-19. And but he was very worried that this wasn't enough support. He had hoped for manpower. And there was confusion, rumors, much miscommunication, but essentially people were thinking that the English were going to arrest their leaders. And Ian McNeill, remember him? He was sort of a contentious person, and he misled other people because he was misled, and he found out he'd been misled because he wasn't told that this was the real thing, and he was misled about the intention to start the uprising. So at the last minute when he found out, he threatened to put a stop to it and told his volunteers not to participate. Unfortunately, the German arms were intercepted by the English Navy. McNeill stopped his men from participating. So frantically, the council got together and they delayed the uprising by 1 day. They were getting volunteers to come for parades, come for maneuvers, but they wouldn't do it on Easter Sunday. They'd do it on Monday. But they had greatly reduced numbers of who showed up because of this McNeill character and because of the rumors flying around. The communication was so bad. The English Navy had intercepted messages from the Germans, and that's how they knew about the German guns. And the English authorities decided that they would wait until after Easter Sunday, because it's a religious holiday, and they would arrest the leaders after Monday, because Easter Monday is a big deal in Ireland too. They would arrest the leaders after Monday. So they had no choice. They began this on Monday. They elected Pearse the first president of the Republic and the commander-in-chief of the Irish Republican Army. The Irish Republican Army began as an official, mainstream, armed military of a free country. And they had a coordinated attack from multiple sides, kind of guerrilla warfare. And you have to keep in mind that a lot of these people were fighting with farm equipment, like scythes. They had counted on these German guns that never came. So, yeah, we're talking farmers from, the back end of nowhere showing up with rakes and hoes. Most of them, if they had guns at all, they had 1871 Mausers or shotguns from the farm or handguns. There were far fewer volunteers because of all the confusion, but they managed to seize the important sites around the city center, and they managed to get control of 2 canals that access the river Liffey. Liffey is this big river that runs right through Dublin. They set up positions to defend themselves against the 5 English army barracks in the area. This was an army of occupation in Ireland for centuries. Pearse read his proclamation, Irishmen and Irish women, at the General Post Office. They took over the radios, the telegraph, they dug trenches, they barricaded roads, they pulled up pavement to create barricades. They took over various bridges, they took over some railroad stations. Unfortunately, they didn't get to one of them enough, and that way the British could bring in their soldiers. So they weren't able to take over Dublin Castle. Dublin Castle in the heart of Dublin is this big grey stone pile, which is the heart of English rule in Ireland. It's where all the big boys are. And so they didn't have enough manpower, and they failed to take over strategic locations. They didn't fail because they didn't try hard enough. They simply didn't have enough manpower. The English had been taken by surprise. And there's talk about a civilian nurse, Margaret Keogh, who was shot by the English army. She was the first civilian killed trying to help people. The English brought out machine guns. Now, you're not going to believe this. I was shocked, and I thought I knew about this. They brought out their machine guns, artillery, and an 18-pound field artillery gun in overwhelming numbers, these machine guns. And they brought into Ireland 16,000 soldiers. They had a gunboat go up the Liffey that shelled the city with this heavy artillery. In one case, for example, they surrounded a bunch of rebels who had occupied a building. There were hundreds and hundreds of English soldiers and 26 Irish rebels in the building. So the rebels did what they could. They burned down English army barracks. The English brought in armored trucks. There was public enragement at troop deaths. And at the end of this uprising, public opinion had been completely swayed. There was so much brutality on the part of the English. One point they broke into a street, a row of civilian houses, and they shot and bayoneted 15 unarmed civilians in their own homes. They weren't participating in anything. They were cowering in their homes. They weren't part of this at all. They summarily executed 6 individuals, including 2 journalists and a kid. They also, in that group, shot Francis Sheehy Skeffington, who was a very well-known pacifist activist who was there to try to, ameliorate things. So it was a little too much for that. Eventually, the Irish were so outnumbered. It was a slaughter, and they surrendered. And after the fact, there were courts-martial in secret. No one was allowed to know what happened in the courts-martial. The Irish were not allowed a defense. 90 were sentenced to death. And eventually, 16 were shot. But of the people shot, not all of them were even involved. One of them was, I believe, Patrick Pearse's younger brother, Willie, who simply was a secretary. He never picked up a gun, but he was shot. Eamon de Valera escaped execution because he had been born in America. Lucky twist of fate for him. But all of this led to a public outcry, and he warned that this would sow the seeds of later trouble in Ireland. 1,800 were held as prisoners of war in internment camps in England, and they were held for several years, some of them, and they became universities of revolution that led to the rise of the Sinn Féin and eventual running for office in 1919 and declaring independence. That eventually led to the signing of this unhappy treaty, which led to the War of Independence. And there has been political dissension in Ireland ever since, associated with sectarian violence, because it cannot be parsed from the historical political situation. And I think it's important for Americans to know, I think it may be different now, that movie Belfast that came out. I watched the first 5 minutes. I couldn't watch it. These were my family, some of my family. And it was too painful to watch. And I think a lot of Americans don't understand the degree of discrimination and random violence. My father's best friend and his family lived next door. This is on the border with the North. Rounded up, suspected of involvement, and this is in the early 20s. They were rounded up by the English, taken into the backyard and shot. The whole family. The only one to survive was my father's best friend. He was just little, very little boy, and his mother stuck him inside a grandfather clock and told him not to make any noise. So you wonder about the emotion and the anger and the troubles that happened. Well, not an excuse, but an explanation maybe. Much discrimination in Ireland. I hope it's not true anymore. You know, I was a tourist when I was there the few times I've been there. Because, you know, they call me the Yank. Never mind, I was born there. But I didn't see it, but then I didn't go to Belfast. I couldn't. We went to Donegal, and that's about as far north as we got. And I have a visceral negative reaction to that accent because of family stuff. And I was glad to get out of there. My aunt lived north of the border until she died as an old lady, you know. And once I sent her a card, my brother said, well, what are you doing? He said, don't write her first name on the outside of the card, you know, just write her Miss whatever. I said, what are you talking about? And he says, don't you understand that people are identified by their first names as to what their affiliation is? If you have a name like Ashley or Margaret or Brittany, you're more likely to be pro-English. If you have an Irish name like Siobhan or Sinead or Maeve or something like that, you're becoming a target. Don't use your first name on the outside of the envelope. So, and this is in the 1970s. So, based on background, class, your name, where you went to church, what neighborhood you lived in, all of this is associated with your political affiliation and can make you a target. I hope it's not like that anymore. And very briefly, I want to talk about the Commemorations. This is the Women's Council. The English called it the Irish Women's Council. These are the women who were involved in the 1916 Easter Rising. And 77 were detained at the Richmond barracks after the surrender. They were imprisoned. This was a women's Republican organization. Of course, a guy was in charge. This is 1916. Michael Mallon was in command, but second in command was a woman named Countess Markowitz, another woman of a certain class affiliated with the English ascendancy, who rejected all of that. And I've talked about her before. I've been to her home in Sligo, Lissadale House. Remarkable place. She rejected the mores of her landed English gentry family and horrified them. She didn't use a side saddle. She rode a horse astride. She bobbed her hair later. She smoked. She had an affair. She would feed. She set up a soup kitchen in their yard and fed the native Irish people on the estate who were hungry. She had a long-term affair. After being married, she married a guy called Count Markowitz. She had some English name. This is her married name. He was Count Markowitz, and he was a Polish count, and he was an aristocrat. And turns out he was a con man. He was neither Polish nor a count, but that all came out years and years later. While she was married, she had a long-term affair with William Butler Yeats, and they worked together, and she worked in the Rising. This women's group formed 2 years before the Rising. They were active many years afterwards. They fought for suffrage. The statement that Patrick Pearse made establishing the Republic called for equality for all, including women. Only one woman was wounded during this whole thing. There was a nurse that was killed, but only one woman in the Commemorations was wounded. Margaret Skinner, she was 24. She was a skilled sniper who led a team of 5 men as a sniper. Remember I said there was a lot of sniping? It was urban guerrilla warfare. She led a team of male snipers. She commanded this team. She was shot 3 times and eventually went to Scotland where she had family. But then she came back to Ireland. And after the Irish Free State was established, people who fought in the Rising got a pension from the government, and they denied it to her because she was a woman. And she fought for it from the mid-20s, and she finally succeeded in receiving her pension in the 30s. Cumann met in pubs to plot the rebellion. Countess Markowitz was sentenced to death. But she wasn't executed because she was a woman. I think she wasn't executed because she was landed gentry. But General Maxwell stepped in and changed her sentence to not to lie, They let her off is what they did. And he's quoted as saying, she is quoted as saying, "I do wish your lot had the decency to shoot me." And she was released. She became later the first female member of parliament for the Sinn Féin in the English parliament in 1918. And before the women left the post office, so what happened was they sent a woman out with a white flag because the English were just indiscriminately shooting every single person they saw. And they thought a woman maybe wouldn't be shot. So when they knew that it was lost, they sent a woman out with the white flag, and she negotiated the terms of the surrender. Then she went back and got Patrick Pearse, and they both went out and officially surrendered. But after that, Pearse, before they actually went outside, Pearse gathered the women that were left together and praised them for their bravery, their heroism, and their devotion in the face of danger. Elizabeth O'Farrell and Julia Grennan refused to leave when the other women were evacuated. They stayed. O'Farrell left after the surrender, waving the white flag. She did that. She is buried, they're both buried beside each other in a Republican plot in Glasnevin Cemetery, where there's a memorial to the members of the Rising. These are some other women who were involved. Kathleen Lynn, who was a suffragette and a doctor, a medical doctor, Irish medical doctor, and she was the chief medical officer of the Rising. She founded St. Ultan's Hospital for Children with her companion. Remember what I said about the LGBT community? There's a number of people. I suspect these 2 other previous women were buried side by side. I'm just guessing. But Kathleen Lynn was a suffragette, had a lifelong female companion, Madeline French Mullen, who was also involved in the rebellion. The surgeon Euphan Maxwell, woman, helped the wounded in the Royal Victoria Eye and Ear Hospital. Nurse Margaret Keogh was killed tending the wounded. Countess Markowitz, when she was arrested finally at the surrender, kissed her revolver before giving it to the English army and told the court when she was facing, execution, trial, told the court she was pleased to cause disaffection among the civil population of His Majesty. April 24th, 1916, they declared a republic for Irish men and Irish women. And the declaration said the republic guarantees religious and civil liberty, equal rights, and equal opportunity to all of its citizens. They fought for 6 days. They were outgunned and outmanned. Elizabeth O'Farrell organized the surrender, escorted Pearse out. There's an iconic photograph of Patrick Pearse at the surrender. She's blacked out of the picture. She was right by his side. Misogyny, huh? These women had been radicalized by their work with trade unions and suffrage, and brave women. There were 1,600 rebels, that's all, and 16 100,000 more British soldiers. This was the first credible insurrection since 1798. In 1848, there was an uprising attempt by the Young Ireland, and in 1867, there was the Fenian Rebellion, and they were all laughed at by the English as fiascos. But 1916 was different. This really changed public opinion. They were hailed as heroes. They were hailed as martyrs. They were an inspiration in their bravery. It was self-sacrifice, and they were so bold that it completely changed the public opinion. And at the first, a lot of chaos after this. You have to understand, this is also towards the end of World War I. Things are still in upheaval in Ireland. The first anniversary of the date was debated, because when do you celebrate it? It was on Easter. Do we celebrate it every Easter? It started on the 24th. Do we celebrate it then? It ended on the 29th. What do we do? So they coordinated with... They had coordinated with Easter, but Easter moves. Easter is a movable feast. So they celebrated it on Easter in 1917, and there was a riot in Dublin. The tricolour, the Irish flag of the Republic, was raised over the rubble that was left of the post office and over the rubble of Nelson's pillar, Admiral Lord Nelson. You know, how offensive. They tore that down. It's like the statue of Robert E. Lee in the South. They tore that stuff down. And cops were sent out by the English to take down all the Irish flags. And as a result, the riot kicked off, and a lot of young toughs, as described as young toughs, rampaged and looted and carried on. The anniversary was an opportunity for a display of defiance by the local separatists. Flags were flown across the country, and it was illegal to fly an Irish flag in Ireland anywhere. And then came the Defense of the Realm Act, which was against freedom of assembly. And then the War of Independence. It just became too dangerous to hold any sort of recognition of the rising. And then there was the war. The first year that they could really celebrate in peace was Easter of 1922, which happened to be April 23rd. And after the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the Irish Free State was created. Now, the Irish Republican Army, the official army of the uprising, opposed this treaty. That was one side. They were anti-making any kind of division in Ireland. And they defied the Irish provisional government, and that's why a civil war broke out. And then the uprising was vindicated, obviously, people believed, after the fact, because they now began to really support the separatists of the Sinn Féin, and there was democratic endorsement of a republic that was declared. But some veterans of the uprising were for the treaty and some were against. The ones that were for were vocal. The anti-treaty people were considered, they were dismissed as unrepresentative and extremist. They did not want to collaborate. They did not want to celebrate an armed action by what they called a radical minority. So, they're characterized in such a way as to minimize their point of view. In 1924, after the Civil War, 8 years after the execution of the leaders and others of the Rising, there was a low-key commemoration, and further Free State commemorations were held. Some, depending on what side you were on, were held in honor of Michael Collins. They were pro-treaty. Anti-treaty people who wanted a united Ireland, they stood for full independence, and they sort of set the tone. So there were demonstrations all over the place. And Eamon de Valera, the guy who didn't get executed because he was half American, he tried to take a public stand. He said the Republic can't be achieved by force of arms, but we will not be slaves. So they drew the line in the sand. So increasingly, commemorations every year became bigger and bigger. Many felt the memory of the Easter rebels was betrayed by faint-hearted compromises on unity and independence of Ireland. In 1932, De Valera and the Fianna Fáil anti-treatyists did a more unabashed celebration, and the pro-treatyists refused to participate. And, eventually they came to the situation that they have now. The Republic is the 26 counties in the south, and the stolen counties in the north, the 6 in the north, are part of England's gasping last attempts to maintain its imperial identity. So I just felt like this Easter always comes to mind, this event in my mind. Probably not to very many other people, but in my mind. And I just felt like this would be such a good thing for me to present, why not? You're going to hear plenty about religion and everything. So let's talk about something else that happened on Easter. And I think it's no coincidence that the rising happened on the rising of Christ. Okay. Now, what would Sunday be without a little poem? And what would Easter Sunday be without an Easter poem? And what would Easter Sunday and in honor of the rising be without a poem by my favorite poet, and hopefully yours, William Butler Yeats? The poem is called Easter, 1916. I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among gray 18th century houses. I've passed with a nod of the head or polite, meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite, meaningless words, and thought, before I had done, of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but lived where motley is worn. All changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. That woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument until her voice grew shrill. What voice most sweet than hers, when young and beautiful she rode to harriers? This man had kept a school and rode our winged horse. This other, his helper and friend, was coming into his force. He might have won fame in the end, so sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought. This other man I had dreamed a drunken, vainglorious lout. He had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart. Yet I remember him in the song. He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Hearts with one purpose alone through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone to trouble the living stream. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud, minute by minute they change. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. A horsehoof slides on the brim and a horse plashes within it. The long-legged moorhens dive, and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live, the stones in the midst of all. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Or when may it suffice? That's heaven's part. Our part, to murmur name upon name, as a mother names her child, when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? No, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse, MacDonough and McBride, and Connolly and Pierce, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. And I'm not 100% certain because I didn't bother looking up, but I do think that in some of these descriptions early on when he talks about that woman and that man, I think he's talking about participants in the rising that he had preconceived notions about, and then the change when it all came down to it. So that's it from me, and very happy happy Easter. I almost said Thanksgiving. Very happy Easter to everybody. I hope y'all have a nice day. And I'll be back. Slán go fóill, slánte.